cry when he chose another woman. She had promised herself that much, one small, stubborn mercy in a night that offered her nothing else. She stood at the edge of the Hartwell ballroom in a gown that had been mended at the hem and altered twice, and she watched Edmund Carew, the Earl of Blackmore, lead Lady Amelia Ashton onto the floor with the particular ease of a man who had never once doubted that the world would arrange itself to his satisfaction. And it had. It always had. Rosalind Voss pressed her gloved fingers together until her knuckles ached, and she breathed through the pain the way she had learned to breathe through every indignity of the past 2 years. Quietly, without trembling, without giving anyone in that glittering room the satisfaction of her collapse. She had loved him. God help her. And she had loved him with the entirety of her foolish, unguarded heart. She had believed his whispered promises in moonlit gardens. She had believed the way he looked at her, as though she were the only woman in a room always full of more beautiful, more eligible, more suitable women. She had believed him. And then his family's solicitor had presented Lady Amelia's dowry figures, and Edmund Carew had made his choice with the cold efficiency of a man settling an account. He had not even told Rosalind himself. She had heard it at breakfast, from a housemaid. That was 18 months ago. Rosalind Voss no longer lived in a mended gown. She no longer stood at the edges of rooms, waiting to be noticed. And Edmund Carew, the ruthless, magnificent, ruinous Earl of Blackmore, was about to discover exactly what he had discarded. Some things, aim once broken, do not mend. They transform into something sharper entirely. The last time Rosalind Voss had stood in this city, she had been nobody. Not in the way that pretty girls sometimes called themselves nobody, as a performance of modesty. Truly nobody, the orphaned niece of a minor baronet, with a leaking roof and a wine cellar that had long since surrendered its last bottle. She had come to London at 19 with 2 serviceable gowns, her mother's pearl earrings, and the particular brand of hope that belongs exclusively to girls who have not yet learned what hope costs. Edmund had found her at her cousin's musicale. She remembered the exact moment, the way the candlelight had caught the edge of his jaw, the way he had looked across a room crowded with far more conspicuous women, and settled his gaze on her as though she were the answer to a question he had not known he was asking. For 8 months she had been his secret warmth, his stolen hours, his letters written in a hand that pressed so hard the words nearly carved through the paper. "You are the only honest thing in my dishonest world," he had written once. She had kept that letter until the morning she learned of his engagement. Then she had burned it in the kitchen grate and watched his handwriting turn to ash with the same hollow calm of a woman who has already done her bleeding in private. She had left London within the fortnight. What happened after, the years in Bath, her great-aunt's unexpected inheritance, the quiet, and deliberate reconstruction of herself, London did not know. London was about to find out. Rosalind stepped down from her carriage onto Grosvenor Street, lifted her chin, and walked into the season that would change everything. The inheritance had been neither romantic nor dramatic in its arrival. Great-aunt Philippa Voss had been a woman of fierce opinions, considerable property, and an absolute refusal to distribute her affections or her fortune to anyone she considered unworthy of either. She had outlived 2 husbands, 3 solicitors, and the patience of every relation who had tried to charm their way into her will. She had left everything to Rosalind, not from sentiment. When Philippa had written it plainly in the letter accompanying the legal documents, "I leave it to you because you are the only one of them who never pretended to like me." Rosalind had read that letter and felt, for the first time in 18 months, something close to laughter. The estate in Bath had been sold. The London townhouse on Cavendish Square had been refurbished with quiet, exquisite taste, no gilded excess, no desperate display of new money, simply beautiful things, arranged by a woman who had learned that true elegance, whispered rather than shouted. She had spent a year becoming someone the world could not easily dismiss, not through cruelty, not through artifice. She had simply stopped shrinking. She had read voraciously, travelled to Florence, and learned to hold a room with the particular stillness of a woman who required nothing from it. She had made 2 genuine friends, Lady Constance Fairfax, whose sharp wit masked a generous heart, and Sir William Holt, a widower of 40 whose admiration for Rosalind was sincere, visible, and already circling London's gossip circuits like a hawk. None of it was performance. But Rosalind was not innocent enough to pretend she had not noticed what it would look like to Edmund Carew when the season began. She had noticed very deliberately. Edmund Carew had not expected the marriage to be warm. He had not married Amelia Ashton for warmth. He had married her for the Ashton collieries in the north, and for the 40,000 a year that would shore up the Blackmore estate his father had quietly bankrupted through decades of spectacular self-indulgence, and for the fact that Amelia had made it abundantly clear she expected very little from him emotionally, which had seemed at 28 like a reasonable arrangement. What he had not anticipated was the coldness of it, not Amelia's coldness toward him, that was mutual and managed. He had not anticipated the coldness inside himself, the particular emptiness of a man who had made a sensible decision, and discovered that sensible decisions, repeated across enough mornings, produced a life that felt like a coat 2 sizes too large, correct in silhouette, wrong in every other way. Amelia had given him an heir 8 months into the marriage, a boy named Charles, and now 14 months old, and currently residing at Blackmore Hall in the care of a nurse. The birth had been difficult. Amelia had recovered, but something between them that had been merely cool became permanently glacial afterward, by silent, mutual, civilized agreement. They attended the same events, they maintained the fiction. Edmund managed the estate, sat in the Lords, and told himself that duty was sufficient compensation for the absence of everything else. He had not allowed himself to think of Rosalind Voss in over a year. He had become extremely skilled at not thinking about her. He was thinking about her now, inexplicably, as his carriage turned onto Grosvenor Street, and then he saw her, stepping through the door of a townhouse that had no business being that well kept on that particular street, and every carefully constructed wall inside him developed simultaneously a crack. The Pembridge evening party was the first true collision. Lady Pembridge hosted with the cheerful aggression of a woman who understood that the real entertainment at any gathering was the human architecture, who stood near whom, who avoided whom, and what happened when the two categories were placed unexpectedly in the same drawing-room. Rosalind arrived with Constance, and who had a gift for entering rooms as though she had been expected and was mildly disappointed by the welcome. They were announced, heads turned, the new ones curious, the old ones recalibrating, the female ones performing an assessment so rapid and comprehensive it would have impressed military strategists. Edmund was already there. Rosalind had known he would be. She had prepared for it, the way one prepared for a procedure one dreaded, with complete information, steady breathing, and the firm decision that it would not undo her. She had not prepared for the way he looked at her, not with guilt, not with the careful blankness of a man managing a difficult situation. And he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has lost, and has only now fully understood the dimensions of the loss, with a recognition that was almost physical in its force, and beneath it something raw that he suppressed almost immediately, but not quite quickly enough. Rosalind held his gaze for precisely 3 seconds. Then she smiled, not at him, past him, at Lady Pembridge approaching from the left, and turned away with the unhurried ease of a woman to whom the Earl of Blackmore was simply furniture in a room she had chosen to enter. She heard his breath change from 4 feet away. She did not permit herself to feel triumphant, not yet. But the night, she thought, was young. He found her near the conservatory doors at 10:30. Rosalind had known he would seek her out, had felt the slow, inevitable pressure of it building across the evening like weather coming in from the north. She had spent 2 hours being precisely herself, engaged, warm with the people who deserved warmth, composed with those who did not, and entirely, pointedly indifferent to the Earl of Blackmore's growing gravitational distress. When he appeared at her shoulder, she did not startle. "Miss Voss." His voice was exactly as she remembered it, low, precisely controlled, the voice of a man who had learned early that volume was unnecessary when authority was sufficient. "Lord Blackmore." She turned, with the pleasant neutrality she might have offered a distant acquaintance. Something flickered across his face. "You look—" He stopped. "Yes." She waited with perfect composure, as though she had all evening and no particular interest in how he finished the sentence. His jaw tightened. "Well," he said finally. "You look well." "How kind." She let a beat pass. "I trust Lady Blackmore is in good health." The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripples cross his expression, a tightening around the eyes. the faint compression of a mouth that had once spoken her name with an entirely different quality of attention. "She is," he said quietly. "Good." Rosalind smiled and turned back toward the room. "Do give her my regards." She walked away without hurrying. Her hands were perfectly still at her sides. Behind her, Edmund Carew stood in the conservatory doorway and watched her go, and felt with horrible, clarifying certainty that he had made the single worst decision of his life. London talked. It always did. Within a fortnight of Rosalind's arrival, the talk had acquired a specific shape. She was an heiress, not a scandalous fortune, but a real one, enough to make her entirely independent of the calculations that governed most women's lives. She was witty without being sharp, beautiful without appearing to require acknowledgement of it, and possessed of a social ease that the ton initially mistook for ambition, before realizing, with faint disorientation, that she appeared to want nothing from any of them. That, paradoxically, made everyone want to give her things. Invitations accumulated. Callers appeared at Cavendish Square with the reliable frequency of spring rain. Sir William Holt had reportedly been seen leaving her townhouse on 2 separate Tuesday mornings, which the gossip mills processed with great enthusiasm. Edmund heard all of it. He heard it at his club, where men mentioned her name with the particular appreciative speculation reserved for women who had somehow escaped the usual categories. He heard it from his sister Dorothea, who reported Rosalind's social ascent with barely concealed delight specifically because Dorothea had never forgiven him for Amelia. He heard it from Amelia herself, once, in passing. "The Voss woman is becoming quite the figure, I understand." Delivered without inflection, which was somehow worse than accusation. What reached him last and hit hardest was the smallest detail, and Sir William Holt had apparently told Lord Ashby at White's that he intended to speak to his solicitor about a certain matter before the season concluded. Edmund set down his brandy glass with a care that cost him considerable effort. The thought of Rosalind belonging to someone else, truly, legally, irrevocably, produced in him a sensation he had no dignified name for. It felt, he thought, like drowning in a room he had personally locked. He wrote to her on a Thursday. Not a letter of apology. Edmund Carew was not yet sufficiently humbled for apology. It was an invitation, dressed in the polite language of social obligation, requesting the honour of Miss Voss's company at a small dinner his sister Dorothea was hosting the following week. Dorothea had sanctioned none of this. Edmund had simply used her name, because he understood that Rosalind would decline anything bearing his crest alone. He was correct that she would scrutinize it. He miscalculated everything else. Rosalind read the note twice, set it on her writing desk, and looked out the window at the grey London morning for a long moment. Then she called for her writing paper and accepted, not because she wished to give him access, but because refusing would suggest she required protection from him. And she required nothing of the sort. She arrived at Dorothea's dinner in deep burgundy silk, which she wore with the unself-conscious confidence of a woman who had long since stopped dressing for anyone's approval but her own. Dorothea, whom she had liked during the brief terrible period of Edmund's courtship, and received her with a warmth that was entirely genuine and faintly apologetic, the warmth of a woman who understood her brother's crimes and had no language adequate to address them. Edmund watched Rosalind from across the table for 3 hours. She did not avoid his gaze. That would have suggested discomfort. Instead, when their eyes met, she offered him the same pleasant, faintly distant expression she might have given a vicar she had met twice at a parish function, acknowledged, unmemorable, entirely unthreatening to her composure. He looked, she thought, like a man being slowly taken apart. Good. She reached for her wine and turned to the gentleman on her left, who had been trying to make her laugh for 20 minutes and had finally succeeded. Edmund's hand tightened on his fork. It was Dorothea who told her, 10 days later, and over tea and the particular intimacy of 2 women who understood each other without requiring explanation. His marriage is finished in every way that matters, Dorothea said quietly. Not as gossip, Dorothea despised gossip, but as fact, offered with the gravity it deserved. Amelia has gone to her family in Wiltshire. They have reached an arrangement, separate households. Charles remains at Blackmore Hall. Rosalind set her teacup down carefully. "I am not telling you this to revive your hopes," Dorothea continued, meeting her eyes with the directness that was the finest thing about her. I am telling you because Edmund is about to make a fool of himself in your direction, and I think you deserve to see it coming. He is already making a fool of himself, Rosalind said. He is warming up, Dorothea replied. I have known him for 31 years. What you have witnessed thus far is merely the overture. Rosalind looked at the fire burning low in the grate, at the neat blue flames consuming the coal with quiet, thorough patience. She thought about the girl who had stood at the edge of the Hartwell ballroom and promised herself she would not cry. She thought about the kitchen grate and the letter turning to ash. She thought about Sir William Holt, who was kind and honest and wanted her with a straightforward, uncomplicated tenderness that asked nothing difficult of her. Does he believe, she asked slowly, that because Amelia has gone, the obstacle is simply removed, that I have been in a kind of suspension waiting? Dorothea's expression contained both love for her brother and a clear-eyed assessment of his failures. I believe, she said carefully, that he has only recently understood the full weight of what he did, and that understanding has come approximately 2 years too late. Yes, Rosalind said quietly. It has. She picked up her tea. The fire crackled. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence held everything that did not need saying. He came to Cavendish Square on a Tuesday morning without warning. This was either courage or arrogance. With Edmund, the line had always been difficult to locate. Rosalind was in the front sitting room reviewing correspondence when her butler announced him, and she experienced a single traitorous heartbeat of the old feeling before she sealed it away behind everything she had built over 2 years. "Show him in," she said, "and leave the door open. And please." Edmund entered the room, and the first thing she noticed was that he looked tired. Not the fashionable languor that aristocratic men sometimes affected, but genuinely, bone-deeply tired, in the way of a man who had stopped sleeping well and had ceased to pretend otherwise. The careful armour of his bearing remained, but it sat differently on him now, like something he was wearing out of habit rather than conviction. He looked at her sitting room, the books, the flowers, the quiet evidence of a life constructed with intention, and something passed across his face that she recognized as pain before he composed it away. Rosalind! He had not used her given name since before. The sound of it in his mouth, after 2 years of silence, did something she absolutely refused to permit. Lord Blackmore, she did not invite him to sit. And he stood in the middle of her sitting room with his hat in his hands. He had taken it off himself, she noted, before the butler could offer, and he looked at her with an expression stripped of every social defence. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "You owe me nothing." Her voice was perfectly even. "Debts require an ongoing relationship between the parties. We have no such relationship." The words hit him. She watched them land. "I know what I did," he said quietly. "I chose security over—" He stopped, began again. "I chose badly, and I did it without the decency of honesty, which was the greater crime." Rosalind looked at him for a long moment, at the man she had loved entirely, and the ruin he had made of it. "Yes," she said simply. "It was." She rose and moved to the window, putting the light between them. "I appreciate your candour, but an accounting, however honest, does not reconstruct what was destroyed. You may see yourself out, my lord." He did not see himself out immediately. He stood in her sitting room for a moment that stretched past the boundary of what propriety permitted, and Rosalind felt the weight of it against her back, like a hand pressed flat against a door. "There is a man," Edmund said quietly, "who intends to offer for you." She turned then, not from alarm, but because the particular quality of his voice required she face it. "Sir William is a good man," she said. "I know he is." And the way he said it, without contempt, without the aristocratic dismissal she might have expected, was somehow worse than if he had been cruel about it. "That is the part that is killing me." The fire in the grate made the only sound in the room. Outside, a carriage moved along Cavendish Square, its wheels rattling over the cobblestones, and then the street went quiet again. Rosalind studied the man before her, the tiredness behind his eyes, the rigid control of a jaw that was working to contain something he had not yet earned the right to say. Once, that expression would have undone her entirely. Once, she would have crossed the room and placed her hand against his face and given him every comfort he required, asking nothing in return, because that was who she had been. She was not that girl any more. "What is killing you," she said carefully, "is not love, Edmund. It is the discovery that the world did not hold still while you made your calculations. What you are feeling right now is consequence. And I am afraid I cannot help you with that." She walked to the door and held it, not cruelly, not with triumph, but with the absolute finality of a woman who had made her peace. He left. And this time, when the door closed behind him, Rosalind stood in the quiet of her sitting room and felt something she had not expected. Not satisfaction, not grief, relief, clean and complete, like the first breath after a long illness. Sir William Holt proposed, on a Wednesday afternoon, in the small garden behind his Mayfair house, with no theatrical arrangement, no performance, simply a man sitting beside a woman on a stone bench, telling her plainly that he wanted to spend his life with her, and that he would consider the refusal equally as carefully as the acceptance if she required time. Rosalind did not require time. She had known for 3 months that William was everything Edmund was not in the sense of being his opposite, but in the sense of being genuinely uncomplicated present. He read the same books and argued about them without needing to win. He laughed easily. He looked at her not as though she were a puzzle requiring solution, but as though she were already entirely sufficient. She accepted him on that bench in the pale afternoon sunlight, and when he pressed her hand between both of his with the unguarded warmth of a man who could not believe his own fortune, she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, finally, as real. They announced the engagement the following week. Edmund heard it at his club from Lord Ashby, who delivered the news with the cheerful thoughtlessness of a man who did not know its precise dimensions. Edmund thanked him, finished his brandy, and left shortly after. He rode out to Blackmore Hall that evening, arriving past midnight to a house that had always been large and now felt vast. He sat in the library where his father had sat before him, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a lineage he had spent his adult life servicing, and he understood with the cold, complete clarity that comes only in the small hours of the night that he had traded the one irreplaceable thing for everything that could be replaced. The estate would survive, his title would survive, he would survive, but some losses, he understood now, did not diminish with time, and they simply became a permanent feature of the interior landscape, a room in the house of oneself that one learned to walk past without opening. He sat with that knowledge until dawn came grey and indifferent through the library windows, and then he rose, because the estate had demands, and the day had begun, and Edmund Carew had always been very good at continuing. The wedding of Miss Rosalind Voss to Sir William Holt took place on a clear morning in late October, in the small church in Bath, where Rosalind's mother had been married 30 years before. It was not a grand affair. Rosalind had not wanted grand. She had wanted true, and the distinction mattered enormously. Constance stood beside her, and wept with the enthusiastic sincerity of a woman who felt things fully, and was unapologetic about all of them. And Dorothea Carew sent flowers and a letter, brief, warm, and containing a single line, near the end that Rosalind read twice. "You were always the right choice. I only wish the right choice had been made by the right person at the right time. Be happy, Rosalind. You have absolutely earned it." She wore her mother's pearl earrings. The dress was ivory silk, simple, without ornamentation, and it fit her perfectly because she had stopped altering herself to suit anyone else's requirements. William held her hand at the altar with a steadiness that asked nothing of her except her presence, and she gave it freely, wholly, without reservation. There was no ghost in the church, or rather, there was, the way there always is at the weddings of people who arrived at love through fire, the faint echo of a different life, a different version of the story. Rosalind acknowledged it the way one acknowledges weather, noted, neither feared nor indulged, and then she looked at the man beside her and let the ghost dissolve. She made her vows in a clear, unwavering voice. Outside, the October sun lay warm and golden across the churchyard stones, catching in the frost that still clung to the grass, turning it briefly into something that looked like light made solid. Rosalind Holt walked out of that church on her husband's arm into the crisp autumn morning and did not look back. Not because the past was not real, but because the present was better. Edmund Carew managed Blackmore Hall well. He was, whatever else he was, a capable man, and the estate prospered under his governance. Charles grew into a serious, unquiet boy who resembled his father in his bearing and his mother in his self-sufficiency. Amelia remarried 3 years later, a Scottish landowner of no particular title and apparently considerable warmth, and both parties were reported to be, by all credible accounts, genuinely contented. Edmund was not unkind after. He was not dissolute, not broken in the visible ways. He sat in the Lords, managed his affairs, accepted the necessary invitations. From the outside, his life looked precisely as it should, for an earl of his standing. From the inside, he lived quietly with the knowledge of his own failure, not with self-pity, which he considered beneath him, but with the particular sobriety of a man who has learned an expensive lesson, and has enough integrity to refuse to look away from what it cost. He heard of Rosalind occasionally. She and William settled in Bath, where she became known for her garden, her Tuesday salons, and the specific quality of laugh that had, apparently, been observed to carry through open windows onto the street in warm weather. They had 2 children, a girl and a boy, whom she was reported to be raising with fierce gentleness and the absolute conviction that they owed the world nothing except honesty. Edmund heard this particular detail from Dorothea, who delivered it without commentary over Christmas dinner in a voice that required none. He looked out the winter window of the Blackmore dining room at the frozen grounds, and he thought about a girl in a mended gown who had believed his promises with her whole heart, and a woman in burgundy silk who had walked away from him without trembling, and he understood, and in the quiet of that cold room, the full dimensions of the difference between them. He had shattered the right thing and kept the wrong one, and the world, with its usual indifferent accuracy, had seen to it that he spent the rest of his days knowing exactly the shape of what he had lost, not as punishment, but simply as truth. Truth, he had discovered, did not require drama to devastate. It only required time, and time, at Blackmore Hall, was something Edmund Carew had in very great supply. If you enjoyed this story, if you felt every ounce of Rosalind's quiet strength, her unbreakable dignity, and the love she finally found worthy of her heart, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It amazes me to know how far my stories travel. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded. The right people do not make you wait in corners. They choose you, plainly, completely, and without hesitation. Until the next story, I'll be here.